noted, and I call the member for Warringah.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak in this grievance debate. Firstly, I want to discuss the impact of natural disasters on our children. This morning, I was fortunate enough to host an event for Royal Far West and UNICEF Australia to discuss this very issue. We were lucky to have a range of experts and even those personally impacted by the Black Summer bushfires, including Scott and his son Ed, that came down, and I'd like to thank them very much for what they came and told us of the experience for them personally. Now, in particular, how Royal Far West was able to help Ed deal with the impact of the bushfires, his attendance at school, and the mental health impact and toll it was taking on the family as a whole. I'm lucky enough to have Royal Far West in my electorate. It's coming up to its centenary celebration. It's been operating so nearly 100 years in assisting country kids. It's a local organisation with a national reach, delivering support for our regional communities, improving the health and wellbeing for our nation's rural and remote children by connecting kids to the care they need. And yes, it has always traditionally been based in Manly. And what's been amazing is with the advent of new technology has been that use of telehealth and that provision and delivery of wraparound services for country kids because they unfortunately can't access them in some of their more remote areas. We know Australia is already facing more extreme weather due to climate change, and communities around Australia have already suffered the devastating impacts of bushfires and floods. But too rarely, when we discuss those events, do we consider how these events are so traumatic and the traumatic impact on our children and how they experience it, particularly in relation to their emotional and mental health. One of the most stark figures from our recent natural disasters that really stood out to me is that according to a just-released UNICEF report with Deloitte, this study found that 1.4 million children and young people in Australia have experienced a disaster in an average year. Children and young people are more likely to experience disasters if they are in regional or remote areas and from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and/or from First Nations communities. And the cost of the impact of the emotional and the mental health trauma is staggering. Children and young people are, as a result of those disasters, 4.2% less likely to finish their schooling to Year 12, meaning that later in life, the cost to productivity is nearly and to their own personal lost earnings is some $3 million. Those children impacted are also between 1.3% and 4.5% more likely to experience psychological distress, leading to some $162 million in healthcare costs increases. So to build resilient communities, we need to consider the youngest community members and their needs, recognise the impacts of climate change is having on their childhoods and build the resilience to climate change. Too often, during the summer, from spring to autumn, we have on the news that various communities are impacted or at risk from bushfire threats, and we get the news that a school is closed. How often do newsreaders or does anyone pause to reflect on what that means for that community? A school being closed means children are left at home, sometimes unattended, sometimes at risk. It means productivity stops because parents stay home as well. And the impact to their educational journey and the failure then to meet milestones is considerable. The UNICEF and Deloitte report had several key insights worth sharing that we need to take up with urgency, and they include a nationally consistent approach towards supporting children and young people in their preparation and response to disasters, a risk-informed approach to disaster recovery and resilience building for children and young people, because it doesn't just happen, as one might expect, straight after a disaster. They've found that, in fact, on average, it's distress and mental impacts and psychological impacts from disasters comes to light on average about 18 months after a disaster for children. And so when we have government focused on delivering disaster relief within a 2-year window from a disaster and expecting everything is fixed, it just shows that that model is inadequate for what happens on the ground. Disaster recovery and resilience building funding should be sensitive to the very unique needs of children and young people. So we must prioritise addressing those gaps in key services for children, investing in the initiatives that work, and the need for sustainable future funding to care for children impacted by climate change. So to that end, I have submitted to the government that they need to continue to fund organisations like Royal Far West in the very essential work that they are doing to support children around the country. Their work, they require some $15.8 million in forward estimates in federal funding. Today, they've helped some 3,000 children from 60 schools and preschool kindergartens in New South Wales and Queensland since the introduction of the Community Recovery Service that commenced in 2020 in response to the Black Summer bushfires. So it's clear that the assistance that those programs is delivering is incredibly important, and we heard that incredible testimony this morning.